Escape vector plotted. Coordinates formed. Launch. Yeah, welcome dear listeners to a special episode. We are speaking with Watt, who is a tabletop role-playing game writer and designer, as well as the creator of the Cloud Empress Ecological Science Fantasy RPG. You may have already listened to our 2 Cloud Empress actual play episodes. If you haven't, you can find them earlier in our feed. There are more on the way. Cloud Empress RPG is an alternate rule set and setting in the lineage of the Mothership sci-fi horror RPG. It places you in a world ruled by the patterns of giant magical cicadas. It's rules light and evokes Nausicaa in the Valley of the Wind, Dune, Final Fantasy, Full Metal Alchemist, and other media. I have a few disclosures to make. 1. I'm a backer of the Cloud Empress Kickstarter. 2. I reached out to Watt to book the interview, and shortly after that, Watt sent me a press kit including some advanced reader copies and other preview material. There have been no expectations on what content I create or what I say about Cloud Empress. We'll give you some info after the interview segment, so without further ado, welcome Watt to the Escape Vector podcast.
Yeah, glad to be here.
And I think we could start with you telling us and the listeners at home about yourself.
Sure. I am, my name is Watt. I'm an indie tabletop role-playing game creator. I've been making zines for about 2.5 years now. My interest in expressing myself more creatively and participating more actively in the indie tabletop role-playing space was sort of peaked during the pandemic and looking for a creative outlet while stuck in lockdown and working from home for the first time. So do my own writing, graphic design and layout now at this point, and also some of the artwork of the zines that I create. And I'm most known for Cloud Empress, the ecological science fantasy role-playing game that's a compatible with Mothership first edition setting.
Good to hear. And where does your moniker come from?
Yeah, it's a combination of a couple things. I'm a big fan of Samuel Beckett, who has a novel by the name of Watt, and it's this almost unreadable modernist masterpiece it's an early work of his, and it sort of processes, I think, some of his experiences in World War II. And then also Mike Watt, bass player of the Minutemen and Firehose. So the sort of punk aesthetic there too. So the combination of those, Mike Watt and the novel Watt by Samuel Beckett, which is also the character in the book.
Interesting. I'll have to look into those.
Yeah, not the most common. Watt in particular is, I think, harder to find now, but should be available. Probably, I would imagine, free as a PDF somewhere.
Okay, cool. Would you mind sharing where you call home?
Yeah, I publish out of the Twin Cities, Minneapolis in particular. So I think the Midwest, I've grown up in the Midwest. I've spent some time in Philadelphia and some other places. And I think the Midwest is sort of the creative center of a lot of my work. And I try to create echoes of that in my writing in particular, and some of the thematic choices I make with the games I make. Giant cicadas being one of them. Midwest having cicadas, and cicadas are which we can talk more about, a central theme of Cloud Empress, or a central setting piece, but also a worldwide phenomenon. But there are large cicada broods in the Midwest that created some early impressions and shocking revelations about nature's strangeness growing up, that I think felt in place with some of the strange, weird, and wacky writing I was reading from other indie tabletop role-playing game creators. So it felt right at home, these cicadas.
Yeah, no kidding. On that note of the giant cicadas and kind of the real world inspiration there, I made a note to ask you about that because in, I believe, the first version or earlier version of the Bean Barge scenario, there was a side panel where you introduced that, or you shared about that. I don't know, has that Does that appear in any current versions of the
No,
materials?
I'm honored that you read some of the earlier stuff. That's really neat. There was a time, like you said, in the first version of the introductory adventure, I believe, in Last Voyage of the Bean Barge, where I attempted this more autobiographical side note in a couple different places and sort of explain the name Imago, which is a real world term for mature bugs of certain species. And that was cut. I still think it's interesting. I got the idea from Jay Dragon in Sleepaway, which was, I believe, their work before Wander Home, but I really like that book. And they had these sort of side panels, one with a cicada, I believe, that had some, what I don't know if they are autobiographical or not, but they felt autobiographical and sort of explained experiences. I think in a summer camp that is like LARP adjacent, maybe. I don't know the full story there, or I'm probably misremembering things. But I had this interesting impression from that, and starting Cloud Empress, and I felt in different times in different creative writing, I've done this real need to differentiate myself. So, oh my gosh, I have to do something different. How can I do something different? My writing space was more adventure game kind of with Cloud Empress, and so I thought, oh, I could apply this sort of memoir autobiographical construct that sort of framed what was happening, and that existed until mentorship that I had with Luke Gehring, who has written a number of like really awesome OSR books and Mothership titles, A Pound of Flesh and Gradient Descent, which Mothership fans might be familiar with. Some really fantastic, strange, creepy, awesome works. And one of the things that I most developed from that mentorship was this confidence in my own creativity and my own writing process, and a feeling of belonging more in the indie tabletop role-playing game writing space, which I found very open and accepting and totally accommodates lots of different viewpoints and stuff like that. But I felt like I didn't need to do something novel or new mechanically, like in the framework of the writing or the organization of the writing itself, and that I could let the other aspects of the writing speak for themselves, and that sort of dropped away as something that I was maybe pursuing more out of a sense of novelty rather than what the central setting sort of demanded.
Hmm. Okay.
Or I, I was led to. I don't know if the settings demanding things for me, but I do try to think about what the world justifies and what gameplay and in particular and the reading experience justifies. That's something I think a lot about. What is the experience for readers?
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. I do have I hope to bounce some of my experiences going through your book and your Cloud Empress related materials.
Mm-hmm.
I'll put a pin in that for now. But you were saying that, and we'll also talk. I hope to hear more about your relationship with the folks at Tuesday Night Games
Mm-hmm.
and others involved in Mothership products or related products. But if you don't mind, let's take a little step back.
Sure.
You before we started the recording, you mentioned that you have a bit of a zine factory going on.
Yeah.
Now, before, I guess prior to like 2 years ago, I had no idea what a zine was. So if you wouldn't mind kind of sharing a little bit, maybe a short description of what a zine is to you and your
Mm-hmm.
work.
I think um, I think a zine is interesting in that its primary, for me and my understanding, is primarily like predicated or defined on its form factor. And so I think my understanding, at least, or loose definition, is just anything that's staple bound or folded. Once you get perfect bound or hard bound, it sort of stops becoming a zine. But I think there's this sort of cultural ethos around zines that probably existed for a long time, but I think are particularly associated with like 80s punk and 90s punk and grassroots political movements and other things and queer education and all sorts of stuff. Minneapolis has a really active and inspiring zine community, and I had gone to some alternative comic expos that sort of framed their artwork or work product as zines. So I think the form factor is the like umbrella definition, but then I think there are also political and cultural conventions that exist within zines that become sort of recognizable, certain art styles, like a very DIY aesthetic. Oftentimes I had some poets that let's have a zine making party and let's cut everything out and let's make it on the fly and let's draw it and let's do it by hand and throw it in a copier and that kind of thing. So Cloud Empress has I think an intentionally polished look, as polished as I can make it, with the certain aesthetic that it's trying. So in that way, I don't think it necessarily imitates or carries forward certain elements of zine lineage beyond the form factor, and also maybe the sort of DIY attitude that I'm bringing to it, as well as maybe some of the queer influences and topics and themes that I might sort of bring towards the material.
If I'm understanding you right, in terms of form factor, it's like a indie booklet that, like you said, has these kind of DIY kind of aesthetics or even methods of producing it, right? But in addition to that, these sort of, let's see, political or other kind of group motifs.
I think the word sort of invokes those things, and by its nature, zines are pretty cheap to make.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes they're folded 8.5 by 11, so you can make them, you can draw them up. You can low tech, lo-fi kind of stuff is really popular, and there's a low bar to entry, which I think is really exciting. And I think one thing that I saw in Mothership in particular that I was really excited about was Sean McCoy, the creator of Mothership, writer, designer, also did all of the artwork in the first edition, to my knowledge, or I guess it's the 0 edition. But he did all the artwork in a really evocative way, but it was all black and white, or pretty much all black and white. I think there was some like blues and green, like blues and greens. Mm-hmm. But it was, you could see like white out, you can see the ink marks and stuff, and the cover remains from the 0 edition. But that was a real invitation to me in particular around Mothership, in that I could do something different art wise and thematic wise, and that maybe the connection to some of that zine culture is that doing something different and unique was valued rather than polished and overly produced. And there's certain art styles that I just have no way that I could afford to do. And I think that's some of the, not to get into like a whole AI thing, but sometimes you see that people drawing towards that overly, maybe not overly anything, but really polished AAA video game concept art kind of look, $1 million board game type of project look. And the way to get that is to use artificial intelligence, for example. So I think for me, having a distinct look that's unique or is sort of heartfelt and human feels a lot more important to me than having something that is really familiar or something that feels like it could exist in multiple different settings or multiple different video games or multiple different games, that kind of thing. Something unique. That one of the goals from Cloud Empress from the beginning was that if somebody saw an image in particular of the game, they could immediately identify it as a Cloud Empress image, provided they're sort of related to tabletop role-playing games, that kind of thing.
Certainly. You have like this big project. I am not that familiar with your work prior. How would you describe the range of your tabletop RPG work so far?
I would say a lot of it is trying to find the sweet spot of weird. My previous title, Hot Stuff on Shore Leave, is a shore leave module for Mothership First Edition, focused on hot stuff and hookups. So it's a pretty it's about what do your characters do on vacation when they're not getting attacked by like aliens or in a corporate horror type setting, and what kind of world would working class crew members of a spaceship, where would they vacation, right? And so in the setting of this book, it's called Port Taxico, and it's a corporation that's bought this vacation island that produces hot sauce that sort of pollutes the skies and makes these brilliant sunsets, but also sort of poisoning the whole island and makes the water burn you if you swim in it unprotected, and your eyes kind of burn and all this kind of stuff. So I thought it was a really cool idea, and I still do, and it was really fun to make. One of my goals with my tabletop role-playing game projects, though, is to reach an audience of some size. I don't know what that size is, but I want people to read my work. I don't know. And I think as a creator, I don't have control over how many people read it, but I think that was a much, much, much smaller Kickstarter than in terms of the crowdfunding amount. I think it was about $1,500, something like that. And then to have Cloud Empress raise with add-ons and all this other stuff like $100,000, that it was a tremendous leap that I did not anticipate. But I was leaning more towards a wider audience for a number of reasons. I didn't realize how niche Hot Stuff on Shore Leave was. I thought it was like, oh, this is a totally obvious cool thing and everyone will want this. And it's, to me, the indie tabletop role-playing game projects I work on aren't about the financial piece. But I do want people to read it. And I do feel like I have things that I want to share with the world, and in terms of my writing and creativity. And so I think there's this balance that exists in all art forms around compromise. I think I have a quote on my desk that's from Roger Deakins, a really famous cinematographer, but he says everything is a compromise. Look at any work of art and you can see it as a compromise. And that's kind of what I think a lot about, is what compromises do I make? What expectations do I adhere to within the genre? And then what expectations do I intentionally try to subvert? And so I think gameplay wise, and the frame of something like Hot Stuff on Shore Leave is the subversion. Probably a lot of it. There's probably a lot of subversion there. It's something you're intended to play between tabletop sessions with friends. So it's kind of not something I'd seen done before. Previous works, I did a zine for a Troika jam called Werewolves of Wall Street. So it's a mini setting in an office building where the stockbroker traders are all werewolves and murdering people in the building, and you're sort of making your way to the top or the basement to get out. And there's sort of a Ronald Reagan figure in the basement with a tube with lasers on it and stuff. So I try to include some commentary or reflection on the world I see or the experiences I'm having in the present moment. One of the things that is core to the works that I create is a sense of artistry, in that I think a lot about and use the games that I make as a form of self-expression and communicating about things that I think are meaningful without necessarily a particular point to make. I don't think I have a specific agenda or a specific action that I'd like readers to take, but I try to use some of the questions that I'm really dwelling on, in Hot Stuff's case, being in lockdown. So what does it mean when you are in an isolated experience, coming out of that or going into that for different reasons? And I sort of process that through the artwork that I create. So Cloud Empress, for example, has a lot of anxiety about, I would say, climate change as a sort of core theme that you may have picked up on, or is pretty obvious. but trying to take that in new directions and manifest it in ways that don't feel entirely familiar, and not approach it from a space that I have a particular answer that's going to solve the world's problems or solve your problem or make up your mind for you. I think the ambiguity and the question are a lot more interesting, both to me and I think to readers, I think, as well.
I find it really interesting. You went from Hot Stuff and Shore Leave, which I think is a supplement, right?
Mm-hmm.
The scope of a supplement, and then you let your creativity like run wild, and you created something to this scope and scale of Cloud Empress. But in both cases, like you said, you kind of created something to work through something that was on your mind. That's really cool as a creative process, and to focus those energies. And so, thinking about Cloud Empress, how did that get started? Was it always going to be based on Mothership? What was the your thought process around that?
I've stumbled into a love of Mothership rather than maybe a love at first sight experience. I'm pretty wary of new systems, and especially rule books. I've grown fairly tired of rule books, so I'm I'm sorry for making another rule book to folks that are also tired of rule books. But I read Ian Usom's blog. Ian was writing a lot about some of his creative works. He had a really interesting zine called The Drain that had this really striking cover and visual elements. And I'm a real big fan of Ian's writing and the books that he publishes, Hullbreach being sort of his current like magnum opus. I'm sure he's going to top it, but which is also a collaboration from the Mothership community. But the Mothership community is really active. I'm part of an active Discord of Mothership creators. And so it was this space to talk shop with people really openly and honestly and get feedback and all sorts of stuff. And one of the things about with this goal of having people read my work, some assumptions I work under that it could be flawed, but some of the assumptions I work under are that one, people seem to care more about things they buy, myself and others, which I don't love that that's the case, but I think it seems like when folks spend money on things, they value them in a different way. That's my impression. And I have like the Epic Game Store and the things that I receive digitally, for instance, for free. Like I have like 50 or 60 Epic games that I get for free, and I haven't played like nearly any of them. And this isn't good. I don't think this is a good thing about me and human beings, at least where we live in society and culture right now. But I find that when people spend money on something, they treat it differently. They've made a decision to acquire that thing, and they've invested a piece of themselves into the acquisition. And so the way they treat that material is different. And so I sort of knew, hey, I want to sell stuff. My experience is also that people care more about physical goods than digital ones in this current environment, and that those experiences are further extended when people buy physical goods, in terms of how they treasure them, how they experience them, how they bring them to the table, whether that's even a digital play space or a physical play space. The other big thing I have is that having played a lot of board games and still playing a lot of board games and reading a lot of role-playing games, I think designers in particular, myself included, we get like bees in our bonnet or like a thistle in our boot or what, I don't know, whatever kind of metaphor you want to use, but we read a rule that we don't like and it's like, oh my gosh, this rule sucks, or I don't want to do it that way, I want to do it different. Or I know how to make this even simpler. You do it this way, you roll this many die and then you roll under and this kind of stuff. And particularly game designers and creatives, like we consume a lot more than the average player. And the factor that I think people often miss in terms of game design, and maybe I don't know, maybe people don't miss this, but that anything new, anything you learn new creates a friction and a complexity to it. So even if it's the simplest rule set, if it's different than what people are familiar with, there's going to be friction, which can be overcome. But for instance, like I have this belief, it could be a wrong one, but people like really love dice and they have dice on hand or they want to buy dice. If you go to Gen Con and these conferences, there's, the dice that people buy are amazing. People don't seem to have the same attachment to playing cards that they have with dice. I think there are some, and maybe poker players or magicians. I mean, I think there are certain communities that really care about cards, but they're like, my experience is that it's harder for a group of people to find a deck of cards to play with an RPG, or like bringing a deck of cards out is not nearly as exciting as bringing a handful of dice out. And all of a sudden people's eyes perk up and stuff. So all that's to say, I wanted to create something that was compatible with Mothership, a system that I liked, that had a positive community, but also wanted to bring my unique voice to that space. I also wanted to create something at the same time that I felt like wasn't beholden to Mothership. So the Cloud Empress rulebook is free online, but it's also standalone. So someone would not need to purchase Mothership and does not need to purchase Mothership or have an experience with Mothership to play Cloud Empress. But if you have, great. Or if you've heard about Mothership, great. Or if Mothership's based on a lineage of, I guess, D100 dice systems. So the idea being that there's less friction for someone to pick this up. And then I particularly like Mothership because of the fragility of the characters. I started playing role-playing games around 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons.
Okay.
Never played 4th edition, but that was kind of the thing. And we picked Pathfinder instead. But despite growing up as a real comic book lover, the sort of like Marvelification of role-playing games and media, where I have a strong anti-violent core to me, I guess, or belief system. And so like, how do I incorporate that into the creativity that I make? And video games in particular, being a sort of regular video game player, how do I create experiences that aren't centered on violence? And weirdly, I was just talking about one of my favorite anti-war films is The Thin Red Line by Terrence Malick. And there's a lot of violence in it, right? But I think the way that certain, or the new All Quiet on the Western Front, I mean, there's a ton of violence in there, but sometimes to create a statement about the cost or the effects of violence, it makes sense to examine violence in its manifestations. And I think that's the connection I had to get a little bit to Cloud Empress. And I'm probably way off of the question at this point, but Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli, which is the largest connection to Cloud Empress. Miyazaki said things like, when people have asked him, like, you draw a lot of warships despite being expressly anti-violent or a pacifist. And his sort of response, which I don't know exactly what to make of it, is like, a virologist has to be around viruses or has to study viruses in order to understand them. And I think there's a lot more to be said about like processing trauma and like, I don't know, male culture and all sorts of stuff, but I don't know. So all of that's to say, Mothership has a pretty unique rule set around panic and stress, at least when it came out, to my understanding. And this aspect of fragility that I think Sean sort of picked up on the OSR community and maybe early D&D experiences, where the player characters can't enact violence on the world without consequence, I think was really interesting. So I hope that answers your question about how I got to Mothership.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know what? You answered like 50 questions. It was great. These were things that were definitely on my mind to hear your thoughts about. You were noting your game's approach to violence, which, for my players, it was really easy for us to switch between Mothership and Cloud Empress. We go back and forth.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's been a really cool experience, but definitely going into Cloud Empress, for at least I thought I won't speak for my players, but I thought I thought a bit about the difference in the approach, and you make it pretty clear in I think the rule book, right near the description of I think, combat rounds and tools of violence or weapons, right? I thought that was really cool and a really bold way of making that vibe kind of clear, or presenting that to the reader to make us think about it and consider it. Doing something different. A lot of the tabletop role playing games I play are pretty tactical. There's combat, and a lot of times conflict is resolved with violence. I'll admit that I'm at this point pretty into that, but Cloud Empress is definitely giving me, or pushing me, I think, challenging me to interrogate that and maybe try something different. So I see, why you made a change like that. You have some other things that set this game apart from Mothership mechanically, like your magic and how you work with skills. Those are really cool. What led you to the decision to grant advantage for skills rather than adding a numerical bonus?
Great question. And this is sort of a like design philosophy I'm trying to adopt as I'm thinking about other designs I'm working on. I've never been diagnosed, but I feel like I have some like low level dyscalculia. I have really bad mental math skills. I can do math with Excel. I can solve problems. I can do all this stuff. But one of the experiences I have is a lot of like educational trauma around math. And I think one of the interesting things about role-playing games, and I've seen particularly in board games with my wife and other folks that maybe aren't like normal gamers or men in particular. And there's probably a lot to unpack. But it's just this like horrified look when they realize they have to do math in front of other people. Like, oh my gosh, what do I have to add together? What skill is it? Oh my gosh, it's a +3. And then you see them do the math and it's like everyone's watching them. And a lot of people, there's maybe the GM or DM's like barking, like, just add them together. Just add your 12 and your 3. What is it? Is it a 15? And maybe this is just bad experiences I had where I've watched on other people, but the other, so
I've seen it happen.
This real fear of like doing math myself in front of other people, even counting on board game tracks. Like I'm like so paranoid I'm gonna count wrong in front of other people. And they'll be like, just add 10 and 16 and then add 3 and I freeze up in those moments because a lot's at stake, it feels like, even though it's just, with friends and no one's going to punish me, but that's just not an aptitude I have. So this idea, like, I want the math to end once the characters are created. There's some math I haven't found a great way to get around in terms of character creation. You add a couple die together, hopefully a low stress environment with your friends. I've also read Sean talk about maybe having wanted to do that or tried doing that at certain points. So I knew that it probably would work. One of the other ideas with as I've just explained, maybe low level dyscalculia or fear of, inability to do mental math to some extent. I also knew that, and having worked a little bit in a board game design space, I realized my skills and aptitudes are most unique and expressed around world building in particular, I think, and creating spaces for stories to unfold. At least that's how I'm trying to position myself and how I think about my strengths. So I use Mothership as a base so I wouldn't have to figure out all the nitty gritty math stuff. The other thing, though, is that from a experiential place, and I have some experience with user design and human-centered design, I really love the moment where someone rolls a die, it's a high-risk situation, and as soon as the die stops moving, the table knows what's happened. And I think that is like a phenomenal moment to me that is lost when math is added. So when you roll, you look, and even D100 even is a little bad at that because you're like, which die is which, and you have to look at both dice. So even I think a D10 would be an improvement for that moment. There would be ramifications I needed to think through about other things, but just that feeling of looking at the die and the entire table being in community together and just saying like, oh my gosh, did you get it? Did you, and immediately looking and knowing, I think that's so powerful as opposed to looking and then having to do even like a simple amount of math. I think roll under systems are really awesome for that.
Definitely. I wish I got onto roll under games way sooner.
The other piece too, I'll share is I often know what to cut from a design or what to change, like house rule, when I start to get like embarrassed about explaining a rule, or it really slows down character creation. So the other big benefit for rule advantage is that you don't have the like 3 skill levels in Mothership, and the skill tree is pretty complicated for particularly like new gamers. That it just takes them a while, like, oh, do I need both prerequisites or just one? And well, what's the advantage? And then they have to look at their character sheet, and so there's this stuff that happens that slows down play around, and it's for depth, right? So I think there's an increased depth in Mothership in that it makes sense that you know, certain things. I'm trying to think of an example, like zoology leads to something microbiology or whatever they are. So there's a logic to it that I think is interesting, and a level of depth that adds to character creation, but it does slow down character creation quite a bit. And I think in some ways undermines the goal of quickly drawing up a character. The other thing too, though, is like, who is your game positioned towards? And one of the weird thoughts I've had about the games I design is it's your like queer friend's first role playing game. Like you might be queer too, right? But like you might have a queer friend that wants to play a role playing game, and it's like, oh, they're gonna dig this, right? It's gonna be low math. It's gonna have a weird theme. It's gonna be inclusive. So that's kind of the design philosophy I use. I don't expect a lot of people to stumble on Cloud Empress as their first game. I think that's probably unrealistic, um, especially given, you know, just the size of things, and the size of the world, and the size of community and all sorts of stuff. But you might have a friend that's interested, or you might be able to bring a friend into the space that you might not otherwise would have.
Cloud Empress is one of my good buddies' second game,
Okay.
and he's played one session already of Cloud Empress. And yeah, I think prior he'd only played one session of D&D. So for
Nice.
him,
Yeah.
Cloud Empress is head to head with D&D and will surpass it because he's totally not into D&D, but Cloud Empress I think strikes a really nice balance for him. So I mean, it just seems like a new player friendly system, right, or way of playing, and even for someone like myself who plays games like Dungeons and Dragons, Cyberpunk, Red, the
Mhm.
more streamlined, and I'm doing the air quotes,
Yeah.
streamlined version of Cyberpunk. Yeah, it's a really nice break from those kind of more involved systems that sometimes do get bogged down.
And sort of another piece around that is that oftentimes games for new players, I've noticed, can often choose like cutesy themes or like sort of glib themes or um, friendly themes, and that's like great. And I think like I have a young child, so like as my young child grows up, like I might want to play some of those with a young kid or a group of young kids. But just because someone's not ready to like get into a really crunchy system or do a lot of math doesn't mean they can't engage with really complex, ambiguous, emotionally disturbing or challenging ideas. And I think the queer community lives with a lot of that as just a reality. And so that's something that I didn't want to sacrifice, and really wanted to lean into is, okay, the complexity is going to be in the ideas, the world, the way that your character interacts with the world and the situations, but that's not necessarily, or doesn't need to be reflected mechanically in terms of some of the operations that happen when certain things happen in the game.
Definitely. If you don't mind, I'd like to get on to the book and the world actually of
Sure.
Cloud Empress. We spoke a bit earlier about, you know, the reading experience and how you approached designing the rulebook. I have to admit, I did something really silly on my first read of the rulebook. It was me just jumping around for practical game master stuff, and that's a behavior I've learned, I guess, from reading other rulebooks. Right? Kind of just, what do I
Mm-hmm.
need to know to have the mechanics down for my players, and then I'll return to the world building stuff. And so in doing that, I didn't realize that I totally skipped the most important world building stuff, like what a Cloud Empress is, what a Prince Bug is, and even more details on the Imago. And these are some of the most important things in the game. And I read through Bean Barge because I knew I wanted to run that, even part of the setting book. And despite all that, I was still so happy with what I thought was, I guess at the time, vague storytelling. I loved the mystique, or what I thought was the mystique. I was making up my own headcanon
Nice.
of how I interpreted like your text and your art. I was just looking at things. I was like, "What the heck is that thing? Why do these giant insects have these unsettling human faces poking out of their upper bodies?" I missed that part in the rule book, and I just saw that art, and I was like, "That's so weird." And I reread the rule book. It is really concise and easy to understand. So it's a me problem, not not a you problem. But that didn't ruin anything. And I hope this anecdote kind of credits how engaging and evocative the art and writing are.
Yeah.
Yeah, what were your ideas on how you wanted to convey like the lore and info on the setting?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you could pick up those things as you were reading, and that's neat to hear about. I mean, the other thing you speak to is that role-playing games are tools for creating group experiences, and so I think it makes total sense to use them however they make sense. And I think I do the same thing if I have a deadline, or I'm like, I have, oh, this group, we're playing this next week, right? I don't have time. So I think that's, and the Bean Barge really intentionally tries to introduce world elements through characters and situations. With Cloud Empress in particular, the first thing that I really thought about, there's a group of artists that create work under the name of Catapulca. Their names are Pabita and Garen.
Mm.
And so the gestation of the project, I had this idea for a game called Motherloaf. It was its original name, and it was this like 1900s version of Mothership, maybe on a different planet, something like that. And the connection with them and starting to do artwork with them, I started commissioning artwork before I really had anything nailed down. And so I was like frantically figuring stuff out. It was like building the runway one plank at a time, or the wings of the plane as we're taking off. And there were certainly some problems with that, in that I would actually have to go back sometimes and say like, oh, all the imago have faces on them now, human faces on the front of them. So that was like um an addition that came about like several months into the project, like, oh,
Wow.
or the position of those faces in particular. I always kind of imagined they would have them, but they would maybe be really hidden, and then they became more prominent. So I would sort of figure things out. I consider myself this sort of like garden or discovery writer, in that I don't do a lot of outlining. Doing a little bit more now, but I really discover things about the world and characters as I start writing. I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, cool. Like, what does that mean? So the artwork has always been I won't do a project unless I know that I have the right art team or the right graphic presentation for it. So it's got to be evocative and unique in particular. And the reason for that is because there are a number of sales that need to happen for a game to get played. And so there's one sale that needs to happen for a game to be read. Someone needs to look at it and either invest their time to download the free rule book or purchase the game. But then in my experience, you need to pitch that to the table. Or in some cases, maybe a player pitches that to the warden or game master and says, hey, can you run this for us? So like, how do you get excited about stuff? And I've heard the argument, and I think is valid, is like your players won't see most of the artwork. I think with the idea with the free rulebook is like you can send them the free rulebook. Like I think not all players do pre-work and all that kind of stuff, but the idea is really to create an evoke a setting in each image. And one of the things that I've done with the art team is for each image, almost the whole world should be understood through a single image. And so in terms of what that looks like is like ecological science fantasy, I want to read in every single image. So, okay, what's the ecological component? Where's the science? Where's the fantasy? And sort of checking those boxes in each image with that like sort of certain Cloud Empress extra whatever that makes it feel unique. So that's the art piece. And then I think the text sort of supports that I think images create questions, as I talked about earlier with some of these like artistic goals. And so I tried to embody that in the writing style so that it would also sort of embody questions and not answer too much. I've shared this maybe too much, but my least favorite thing in like all media is you open up particularly role-playing game books, but maybe also art books and stuff, and you get this like 5 to 10 page timeline of events, like world building timeline, and it can be the coolest setting, and I really struggle with that, and I also feel obligated to read it for some reason, which is maybe another me problem. But how do I create a world that is based in relatable experiences and also gameplay? I mean, that's the big piece. Anything that can't be experienced in gameplay really, I mean, isn't going to be experienced by more than the person reading it, and even then, it's going to be difficult to get through. So I think visually, that's the starting place. But a lot of that too then is me doing a lot of art direction work and being really intentional about art direction. And I have a great art team where I'll like, really get granular with some of the changes that I'm requesting, or even I do some of the art for the project, but I'll even like, not, I'll be like, oh, could you make an orb like this, or, draw the shape or do some markups on the pieces. And I have a team that supports that. So I think that's the big piece, leading with the visuals, but then making sure the writing's really tight and doesn't disappoint once people start reading.
Yeah, and on what you were saying about kind of experiencing the world and the game through the art, right, and the text. I mean, there is a part of the book actually that really threw me for a loop, and so it's actually about Prince Bug.
Oh yeah.
So it's so cool how the information and description stats for it are presented in the setting book,
Mm-hmm.
and just so differently from anything else in that book. I read that column several times to reinterpret it. And for me, my first time, it put me in, and I have it open actually,
Yeah.
another window, and I'm trying not to look at it because it's psyching me out. But the first time, it put me in the mindset of a character that was dealing with some sort of psionic or oracle beaming intrusive thoughts. And that's what I interpreted as the italicized text. And then the bolded text was what I thought maybe that same character that's trying to battle these intrusive thoughts, the psychic assault, they're trying to analyze this threat before them, the Prince Bug. And I was interpreting the underlying text as kind of guiding the behavior or state of Prince Bug every round of combat, or even its effects on the non-player characters and player characters. So I think this is just to say I had this whole kind of pseudo gameplay experience, like reading that column and trying to make sense of it my way. And it just evoked a vibe for this character. Do you want to talk about what you intended for that, or do you want folks to just
Yeah.
experience it and sit on it for a
A
while?
little A and B. It's sort of my big surprise, I would say, in the book.
Oops.
No, I mean, I'm happy to talk about it. And people are going to be hopefully flip into the page. One of the ideas in the setting is how our perceptions and our ideas manifest in reality, and in an exaggerated way in the world of the hereafter in Cloud Empress. And so we're introduced to the legend of Prince Bug in the rulebook with very evocative and sort of, I would say, empowered artwork. A person riding confidently in armor. And the character the players meet is sort of a maelstrom and almost unknowable to some extent, or at least not presented in any other way that we've seen characters. And the Imaga themselves, we only get sort of outside glimpses of. And so this is sort of a conduit between worlds, some kind of human being, some kind of humanoid figure that is also deeply intertwined with the Imago. And so what does that manifest like? And so this was that attempt at trying something different. I don't know. And And I think is it I think it's Leaves of Grass. I wanna
Oh yeah,
you might is that the book title? It's like the scariest book I've
House
ever
of
read.
Leaves,
House of
maybe.
Leaves. Yeah, House of Leaves. So I'll stop. So yeah, the House of Leaves book is an experience in reading, right? And so this is my sort of touchstone. There are other works that try to do similar things, but again, um one of the cornerstones of the creation is the experience on the reader as as important as the experience at the table. And one of the things that Luke Gearing and I really talked about a lot, and I think um, helped clarify for me, is that you can present things extremely clearly in a role playing game book. You can say, Prince Bug is a maelstrom. He's really chaotic. There's something crazy going on, or something really strange going on in this experience. And my current belief is that if you can evoke that experience in the reader, it may actually become more clear and become more memorable than expressly writing what's happening very clearly and expressively. And so I think one of Luke's challenges to me in this mentorship was questioning defaults. What are the default presentations in RPGs? And very often they're presented as guidebooks or instructional texts for a game master or warden, in that in the very first paragraph it's going to explain everything that's going to happen, and then you're going to read through it, and they're designed to be in many cases like reference texts, which is very helpful in some cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having everything bolded and put in certain places, and I've tried to do some of that to make it not a totally unusable. But you'll see very common, like for example, with NPCs, it'll say they want this, they like this, they don't like this, they have this, they don't have that. If you do this, they'll do this. And my approach to NPCs, which obviously Prince Bug is one of them, and what we're talking about is this like this weird glimpse into their personalities and their lives, again with this idea that it might become more evocative and memorable, and with that touchstone it might actually become easier to play. At the very least it'll be more interesting to read, I think.
Oh, it made an impression. I'm picking up what you're putting down. That's for sure. I know, you're a busy person and designer, and you have a hard stop. So I was hoping we could do maybe just a kind of rapid fire
Yeah,
question.
let's do it.
Um, I mean, there are a lot of relationships in Cloud Empress, or in the books for Cloud Empress. Who are your favorite characters or storylines?
I gotta go with Cloud Empress. Uh, Cloud Empress is really a look at celebrity,
Mm.
this idea that we embody celebrities with so much power and so much belief, and encourage them, and and financially support them, like Cloud is in the Cloud cities. She's sort of given this incredible gift and position in society, but every time she grants a wish, it reduces, I think, a third of her life. Can't remember what I wrote exactly. I think it's a third. So and the wishes cannot be for her own benefit. They need to be for the benefit of others, and made by other people. And so it's this idea that, hopefully not too on the head, but this sort of look at what does a society do when it rests its hope on a single person, or its beliefs or needs on a person that's fragile and human.
Dang, that's really interesting. Um, are there other things you want to explore in your tabletop role-playing game work beyond like what you're doing now?
Um, Definitely expect more Cloud Empress. I have a trilogy of books planned, um, with additional settings. One of the folks that have backed the Kickstarter know that there was a whole biome that we had to cut for space that'll be appearing in the near future, called the Deadlands, which is sort of a space that one of the cloud cities has crashed and totally devastated this land, turned it to sort of an ashen desert. So that we know is coming, and more surprises around the way for Cloud Empress. Eventually, goal is to look at the clouds themselves and the cloud cities, and we have this whole emperor figure that's very mysterious right now. So those are all artistic intentions I have. The other thing I've talked a little bit about on my Discord, which folks can find on the Kickstarter page or other places, is this idea of a band game, a game where players take the role of people in a band, and sort of a look at artistic expression, both in a group setting, but also in that same sort of travel setting. So how do these folks travel from space to space, and book gigs and all these like sort of minutia that being in a band sort of requires, on top of like that varying motivations for artists. So that's really early on. I've talked about it a little bit, but that's sort of my other space that I'm kind of thinking about, is thinking about the artistic process as something that might be expressed in a role play game setting.
That's super cool. That last one, the band one, was not expecting anything like that. I don't think anyone was. That's so cool. Let's see. I did save, I think, the most important question for last.
I'm ready.
I think everyone has this on their mind. Cloud Empress Orange. How did it come about? What were you intending to evoke?
Yeah, so that's an easier question to ask than you might think. With Cloud Empress, I was not originally the graphic designer. I had the graphic designer had to drop off the project very short notice, very close to the Kickstarter. So I developed some of the language, but was expecting sort of a graphic designer sort of take us home and figure stuff out. So I looked for inspirations for the sort of vibe that I was trying to create. And there is a indie comic artist by the name of Lando, like Lando Calrissian, but just Lando, who makes some really incredible line work. And I picked up a zine, I want to say in Nashville, like 10 years ago, that had this really weird vintage look to it. Like it was part of a larger existing catalog, but it wasn't. And so it always stuck with me, but it was this like bright pinkish kind of orange color, and it was part of this larger setting. So I looked at it, and it's always been an inspiration and something I was like, okay, this is kind of evoking the vibe that I want to evoke. So doing research on that zine, I found that it was itself evoking a Penguin classic sci-fi collection or line that was, so in the 70s, Penguin had a series of sort of classic reprints of science fiction novels, and they used the same orange color in this sort of liney 70s aesthetic science fiction kind of thing. The Cloud Empress font is like font that's similar font that's used in like 70s Dune covers. So it was really evoking this sort of 70s fantasy adventure. And I've said before that I wanted to create kind of a space for when people hear about role-playing games, they often bring to it their hopes of adventure and exploration and fantasy and just like exploring these amazing worlds and engaging with magic in particular. So I wanted to meet those expectations, but then subvert a lot of the expectations around violence in particular. And so that's kind of the match that I brought, was like bringing this sci-fi aesthetic from the 70s in particular, and using this bright orange because it was just kind of out there color wise. I think it's the orange that I use, but oftentimes Photoshop will like warn me not to use it. It'll get, like when I pick it, it'll start giving me like exclamation points, like this is too much, like you need to stop using this color. I don't know exactly what that means, why it's warning me. But I think sometimes it's just so bright and out there. So that's the sort of vibe that I was trying to go for, and use all of my work, I think, is really evoking tropes and then subverting them, in particular too, because there's no way to fully illustrate the imaginative space that's happening at the table in particular. And so playing with a group of people, each is bringing like an imaginative space to life as they play this character. And ideally they match up somewhere. Ideally people are developing the same picture of what's happening, to create tension, to create conflict, to create humor, all these different things. And I found that needs some foundation in tropes. And so like Studio Ghibli and Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind is a big trope, but also Dune. So those, and then weirdly, not weirdly, there are so many connections between some of the media I like. So Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind, for example, reimagines the sandworms of Doom as these which are these like large, like crabby kind of like trilobite like land creatures. But then also Hayao Miyazaki's inspiration from Mobius in terms of Nausicaa's aircraft, for example, is directly inspired by Mobius from accounts. But then Mobius worked on Jodorowsky. Am I saying that right? I think so. Jodorowsky's Dune. So he was the lead illustrator for the concept art for that film, and so was designing stuff for Dune. So it's this real like conversation with itself. And then that graphic design, some of that design went into the like David Lynch Dune. So all this stuff, this sort of like conversation with. So that's how I sort of justify my participation in the use of tropes and similar ideas. Is that it's sort of a shared language we're creating that then can exist in this sort of shared conscious that when we invite somebody in, we all kind of know what we're talking about on a base level, or we can show folks the artwork in the book and they can kind of figure it out pretty quickly. But then where do we take that into new spaces to explore ideas and conflicts and meaning that is very relevant to, let's say, 2023, or at the time somebody picks it up and reads it. I think that's one of the really exciting things about art is that you can read a text dozens or hundreds of years after it was created and still find new meanings and applications for both the personal as well as the cultural. So,
yeah. For this last question, you went metaphysical on our asses.
Yeah, you were saying you rambled a little, so apologies for
That was awesome. No, I could relate, and that was really cool to get your thoughts on that. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. Of course, before we wrap up, are there any shout outs that you'd like to make at this time?
I would say thank you for having me. In terms of, I guess the book, I thank Sean McCoy and Luke Gehring and my some of my loved ones for their support in allowing me to do this. First, Sean for creating like a really fun game, but also a really open and inclusive community, and taking the time to support me, give me feedback, invite me onto his blog and newsletter, and sort of promote Cloud Empress, get a pull quote for the book. So those were all really phenomenal things, and just have an open license so that other folks can kind of play in the same sandbox and not have to sort of create everything all over again. And then Luke Gehring for running this really fantastic mentorship program around inviting inclusive up and coming tabletop role-playing game creators to hone their craft through critical reads of existing texts, as well as check-ins and writing around their work. It was a real pleasure and just totally free and very generous of Luke to do that. So those are I think and then shout out to, finally, probably most importantly too, is just the whole team of the project. There was tons of people that worked on it. We didn't get to talk about it, but there's 5 different adventures written by 5 different authors that took their own spin. Cloud Empress is always intended. It has its own sort of weird open license, even being part of Mothership. So I want folks to create their own stuff in the world if they're interested, and really appreciate the art team, that the editing that happened, and I'm frantically trying to think if I'm missing anyone. The sensitivity, they're all in the credits, but it was a group effort, playtesters. So, and then I guess the backers, I don't know, the people that believed in the idea, and I have 3,000 or so copies in my basement that I'm I'm slowly and as fast as I can shipping out to folks over the month. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity to be here and to thank those folks.
Definitely. Thanks again, and great job on Cloud Empress. Keep up the good work, and yeah, take care, and hope to keep in touch.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much.
And that was Watt, creator of the Cloud Empress RPG. Thank you, Watt, for your time, and thanks to my dog for making a guest appearance. Here are excerpts from Watt's creator statement. Quote, Cloud Empress explores resilience in the face of catastrophe. There is no apocalypse in Cloud Empress, only the resilient earth and the many things who live upon it. Unquote. And, quote, with my games, I am always looking to connect with new gamers. Folks at the margins may be intimidated by math-heavy procedures and overwhelming character sheets. Cloud Empress evokes the tropes of adventure for those who need to explore the world outside of Dungeons & Dragons. It seems like a stretch that someone new to TTRPGs would stumble upon Cloud Empress, but Cloud Empress could be your friend's first role-playing game. Unquote. At the time of recording, the Kickstarter is in the fulfillment stage, but there are 2 first-party Cloud Empress products available to the public. The rulebook PDF is free and is under 60 pages, and the pages are zine size, so smaller than the standard 8.5 by 11 pages. The starter scenario or adventure, The Last Voyage of the Bean Barge PDF, is free and is a 10-page zine booklet. My group completed it in about 3 hours. These haven't been released to non-backers yet, but there is a setting book plus 5 scenario adventure booklets. The setting book, The Land of Cicadas, is awesome. It has a sort of Super Nintendo style overworld hex map, overland travel rules, world building, NPC info, zoned random encounter tables, plenty of seeds for adventures, actual conflicts, small and large, to stumble upon, and even what I feel is a bonus adventure in the Thick Woods area. GMs, you'll find info on the Prince Bug and Cloud Empress in here too. I will talk about the 5 zine-sized adventures another time, but I will say that I have read them all, and I'm excited to run them. We have started one already. So, check out the free PDFs for the rulebook and The Last Voyage of the Bean Barge on the Drive-Thru RPG online store. Then look out for the setting book and the 5 zine-sized adventures. Follow Cloud Empress developments on cloudempress.com. Free bonus content gets released in monthly newsletters too. And you can follow Watt on Bluesky. The tag will be in the episode notes. Our music is from Epidemic Sound. Check out the show notes for credits. As always, thanks to our listeners. Connect with us on Instagram or by email. Tell your friends and gaming community. And finally, lock on to our signal, subscribe to our feed, and set a notification alert for when our episodes release. Over and out.